Good afternoon. I'm Jane Pickering, William and Muriel Seabury-Howell's Director of the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology. I'd like to welcome everyone to the virtual opening of Radcliffe's new exhibition, Precipitation for an Arid Landscape, by artist Gala Porras-Kim. This exhibition and Gala's Radcliffe Fellowship center on collections from the sacred cenote of Chichén, Itzá, a Maya archaeological site in the Yucatan peninsula of Mexico. The Peabody Museum currently stewards collections from across this site, including items dredged from the cenote. I first met Gala in February 2020, and I think, in fact, it was one of the last in-person meetings I had. At our meeting, it was clear that she brought a unique and innovative contribution to how we can collectively reflect on museum histories and the treatment of collections. As one of the oldest museums of anthropology, the history of the Peabody is intricately linked to legacies of colonialism and imperialism. In its development as a research and teaching institution, the Peabody directly benefited from collecting practices that we recognize today ignored the wishes and values of families and communities. We are committed to ongoing collaboration with descendant communities and examination of the practices that led to the acquisition of the cultural material at the museum. As we implement a holistic program of ethical stewardship, we are also thinking about the culturally responsive practices often missing from traditional museum care and conservation. And as stewards, we want to understand how we can undertake these additional forms of care. Gala's work addresses these concepts, and we have deeply appreciated working alongside her and the creative and thoughtful staff at Radcliffe on this project. Before I introduce Gala and Martha, I'd like to encourage those watching on Zoom to use the Q&A feature to submit your questions at any time during the program. The speakers will address as many as they can. Since we anticipate a lot of questions, we ask that you keep them short, and this will enable speakers to address as many as possible in the time we have. Also, in the interest of time, my introductions of Gala and Martha will be very brief, so I hope you will look at their full biographies on the event webpage. Gala Porras-Kim is based in Los Angeles, and her research-based practice focuses on the social and cultural contexts that shape how sounds, language, and history have been represented in a variety of disciplines, from linguistics to history and museum conservation. She has worked with museums across the globe, including the Metropolitan Museum in New York, the British Museum, and the Museo Nacional in Rio de Janeiro. And she is currently an artist in residence at the Getty Research Institute. Gala is in conversation with Martha Buskirk, who is a professor of art history and criticism at Montserrat College of Art in Beverly, Massachusetts. She was herself a Radcliffe Fellow in 2000 to 2001, and her research focuses on art and law, including artists' rights advocacy, intellectual property, and potential conflicts between proprietary control and public interest. And her recent book, Is It Ours? Art, Copyright, and Public Interest, considers issues of artistic expression and creative protection as they relate to contemporary law. So it is now my pleasure to give the virtual floor to Martha Buskirk.
So, Gala, I believe that you are going to start us with a sort of a run through of the exhibition. So we actually have this, in a sense, a disadvantage that we're doing this virtually, but also a kind of an advantage. So you're going to give us a virtual tour of this particular exhibition, but you're also going to make some comparisons to some of the other ways that this particular project has been realized across a series of exhibitions that you've been working on. So I'll hand things off to you to do that initial slideshow.
Yes, since we're having an opening of the exhibition, I thought that on Zoom might be nice to actually see some of the work before we go into discussion. It's the first time I've had an opening in online, and so we will try and see how we can experience this exhibition also in context with other works that are made that are not on view, which contextualize the whole project with the cenote objects, as Jane was talking about. So this is what the Radcliffe Gallery looks like right now. I actually haven't even seen it myself in person, but thank you, Meg, for curator of the exhibition, for putting it together like this. The works are one of 3 bodies of works that I'm making with the collection of Chichén Itzá, as Jane had spoken, and they're sort of subdivided by 3 subsections of the objects. One is the works that ended up at the Peabody, one that ended up at the Field Museum in Chicago because some of the objects got transferred there, and one that is the objects that were returned to Mexico, I think in the 60s and 70s. And so these works that you see here are dealing with the ones that are currently at the Peabody Museum, because of course it's at Radcliffe, and this exhibition was actually the only venue in which Meg managed to get one of the artifacts from the works on view. And because so much of the show is about conservation and how the institution has preserved these objects that were votive offerings to Chaac, the Mayan rain god, at some point. The central theme of the work is how to figure out how to reunite this the rain with its objects and property rights and conservation. So it's more like institutional interest versus what the last owner, who might still be around, their wishes. And so this work is actually the artifact that Meg borrowed from the storage, and then a replica of the encasement that holds this fabric fragment that it has been dipped in rainwater, and then it's dried as a proposal to figure out how they can be stored differently in a way. Here you have a close-up of the case. And then part of the work is, of course, I mostly work with drawings, and is the cataloging of the fabric fragments that are in the collection. And what was interesting to me about these was that, the fabric fragments are really just these dust particles that have lost their binder and now are just sort of being held together by their past, by a past shape that they might have been in. And of course, if they fragment, does that, raises questions such as, does that multiply the objects, or do they get a new number, or questions like that. So I just wanted to also visualize what it looked like in relationship, because, when you experience these objects in the catalog, which is mostly online, that's how I got them, it's very difficult to actually see the breadth of the amount of material that might be. And so these are drawn from the online catalog to scale of whatever the specs that were online were. There's this and this and this. And also in the exhibition, there are small drawings of the way that the objects have been placed in books. And so the graphic design and layout of specific book layout is also a new categorization of these objects that might not have been, that are really uncategorizable. So the idea was to figure out how our current cataloging systems or museum methodologies might be overlaid onto objects that might not have anything to do with that specific ordering or something like that. Another part of the work is this copal installation, I guess, that it's copal was one of the main materials that was dredged out of the cenote, and it's tree sap. And so this copal is mixed with some of the dust that was collected from the Peabody Museum, because I was thinking about the idea of figuring out how much material would have to be lost from each one of these objects, enough that it might make the rain happy if somehow it got reunited with its own material. So each copal block mixed with the dust every time that this work gets shown, the institution where it's shown has to figure out a way to get rainwater onto it. And I think that for the Radcliffe version, Meg has, and the institution has to figure out how to get the rainwater on it. So Meg has decided that maybe it's public volunteer. So I think that in the exhibition, you can grab some rainwater and then dump it in. Of course, as part of the work is also this letters that I have been doing with other projects, to have a conversation with museum people. So in this case, is with Jane. And it's sort of a way to to put a conversation so the public might be able to see these questions about, conservation or what stakes are of it, who are all the people and entities who might have stakes over whatever the collection might be, whether they're human or spiritual or etc. And questions about how the current historical condition of an object in a museum might overshadow whatever the original function might have been. So those are the works in the current show, and I want to quickly just contextualize it in the broader picture. In New York, there's also the other, the main part of the cataloging, and so there's also this room with documents from the Peabody, also available at the Radcliffe, where you can sort of get background information on the legal procedures and background and back and forth between the man who dredged it and the director of the Peabody at the time, etc. And of course, it spans over about 70 years of time, and so it keeps editing on, and it's kind of just to see a broader picture of how those objects got there, and to see that it's not so black and white. How objects exist in the collection. Along with this is also the same the rest of the objects that are currently at the Peabody. There's 7 of these 6 foot by 6 foot panels that same as the fabrics, just catalog whatever the information available online is. So they are just to see. This one is the Copal version that they did, in which they have rainwater dripping from the ceiling, and it touches the Copal mixed with the dust as well. And finally, this is the version that was shown at the Sao Paulo Biennial, which is the 27 objects that went to the Field Museum, and the way that they wanted to get the rainwater to touch this Copal also with dust from the storage of the Field Museum, was to make this condensation cube in which the rainwater would continuously be there. So that's just a broad overview of the thing. Of course, a third of the project, which is the objects that got returned to Mexico, INA, is still forthcoming and probably will be done at some point this or next year.
So maybe we could start out talking a little bit about the cenote itself, because obviously you did pretty extensive research about how these objects first arrived at the Peabody. And this Edward Thompson, who dredged these objects, played a big part in your research. So maybe you could just talk a little bit about what first brought you to research this particular collection and some of the complications that you discovered.
I think that the Peabody is just one of many museums that have objects in their collection that might still have a function for some other entity. But the way that I got to it was because, of course, I am very interested in Mesoamerican objects and how they live mostly in US institutions, but also because I was looking at the law and how through different interpretations of the law, some object might be able to get from one place to the other. And the idea was to figure out a way in which the same legal procedures might be able to be used the opposite way, like on behalf of the rain, because in theory, the last owner of these objects was the rain, since it was receiving all of these votive offerings, and the rain is still around, so maybe it still has stakes on its works. And what I really liked about the specific Peabody collection was that the conservation methodology was going against the original place, which was submerged in this water. And so the idea of these objects being in the driest spot ever was in such conflict with the rain being able to touch its material. And so not that I have any answers to how to get them back together, but the projects for these proposals to figure out how those objects can still be in the collection as historical objects, but still might be doing part of whatever it's supposed to be doing with the rain.
So one part of that obviously is just thinking about a lot of different competing interests. And so Jane mentioned in the introduction that some objects were eventually returned from the Peabody to Mexico, but I think you've made the point elsewhere that in that situation, they're essentially returned from one museum to another museum.
Exactly.
And so you're trying to come up with a slightly different scenario here.
Yeah, because I was, in these questions of moving the objects from one place to the other, it doesn't really resolve the relationship of those objects with the rain, because they'll probably just go back to Mexico and be in a very dry storage still. And also Mexico wasn't Mexico at the time that those objects were put in the cenote, etc. And the other thing about the cenote and the Peabody collection was that the Peabody wasn't the only institution to like go in and have get objects from that cenote, because afterwards the Carnegie went in and got some, and then the Mexican government got some. They even drained the entire pool out to just be like, why do we even have to dredge, because we can just remove all the water and then take all the stuff out. No, so in a sense it's not necessarily so specific about which human institution or entity might be, because there's this very specific subcategory of collections which are attached to like a spiritual or not just spiritual, but a function that is supposed to be ongoing indefinitely. And so in a sense, some human in the past relationship with their rain, in their mind, it was going to be there forever. And so in theory, it's still going on,
Mm-hmm.
And so that's sort of the category of objects that I'm interested in.
So one thing that was really intriguing that you touched upon when you were talking about the exhibition is that some of these objects, the textiles and wood objects in particular, were preserved because they were submerged. And so you've actually zeroed in on the fact that removing them from the water and sort of transferring them to the typically very dry conditions of storage actually necessitated some very sort of invasive treatments to actually hold them together.
Right.
So you've made some distinctions between different types of objects.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in a sense, this show is so much about conservation, because it's the idea of like what conservation is. I think that the focus, of course, is in keeping a material integrity, as opposed to any other, contextual or functional thing that an object might have. But in this case, Meg actually found some documents, because actually the research got cut because of COVID and I had to return. So Meg kept looking at these conservation, and she found these documents that basically were describing how the conservation of the Peabody people were teaching Thompson how to store these fabric fragments in jugs of water, because as soon as they came in contact with air, the binder that kept holding them the entire time was disappeared, and so it just became dust. And so it was interesting to think about how the method of keep putting it in a collection was going actually against conservation itself by exposing it to air. And so also, I guess many of these ones that kept falling apart got injected with a different binder. And so in a sense, when I was thinking about the installation of the copal and the dust that was collected to return it, reunite it with the water, with the rain, I was thinking about these specific fragments that are essentially just dust being held together by a conservation binder. They're not the actual fabrics anymore. They're just kind of being held in the shape of a past object.
So one other part of that is then just this whole idea of what preservation retains and what preservation perhaps destroys. And I know here, as well as other works that you've done, you've been really interested in thinking about what happens when these objects that were made for a spiritual purpose enter into a secular institution, and how secular institutions might somehow interact with the objects in a way that remains true to their original purpose.
Yeah, because I think that when the institutions, accession these specific objects, then in a way they turn into those ritual sites to a certain degree. No, it doesn't. The relationship doesn't only go one way in like historicizing a material, but the ritual material being in the building itself turns the building into like a very, very, let's just say, a very dry cenote. And so in a way it's figuring out, okay, if those objects have to continue to become part of this historical narrative, which of course they are also, then within that system, how can this other function in history and not history, function and relationship with this past person or human and the rain, if the rain has an agency, how can how can it still be like a working method to try and resolve those two conflicting ideas, no? But there's got to be a way, I think, because there's so many loopholes in everything that, and so many of the projects are just to figure out these, not that is the only way, it's mostly through, I think that that's what the letters are for, is to begin a conversation with people who actually know how those objects are in the institution, for them to think about how it can actually work. Because I don't know the entire structure of how museums really work, in the day-to-day details or whatever, but I think that it's more like trying to prompt somebody to maybe come up with something that might be possible.
So here, you're dealing with some pretty charged issues. Obviously, there's a very extensive dialogue right now around questions of repatriation, and you're wading right into the middle of it in terms of thinking about questions of ownership. But it seems like you also have actually, in this instance and others, despite the fact that you're asking some fairly provocative questions, also managed to have a lot of dialogue, a lot of collaboration. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that, a little bit about the sort of intersection between critique and collaboration in your work.
Sure. I think that because the works that I'm interested in don't necessarily have a last human owner, these questions of the repatriation don't really count, because it's thinking like, return it to what if it's the rain? No, the rain is also in Cambridge. And so in a sense, it's thinking like, okay, of course, with many of the other works in the institution, those questions might be more relevant, but those are ones that I haven't, that are not necessarily ones I am specifically thinking about, because I am trying to focus on also the importance of keeping some of those objects in the institution. That these functions, the original one and the next one and the next one, just keep adding onto each other, but not that it can only be one. So the idea is basically, how does a material hold multiple contexts within it, and not that one erases the other. But of course, the way that those objects function today in the museum is prioritizing the institutional historical function, and with reason, because the building is made for that, but in a sense to not erase completely the other functions that these objects might have.
So one of the very early works that you did that involved a letter to the institution was to LACMA, and you were thinking about a specific collection of West Mexico ceramics where the the collector's name is now associated with that collection. And you were proposing some alternate ways of perhaps thinking or categorizing those works.
Yeah, I think that when you look at museum regulation, you can find what the actual priority of the institution is, and then when you read whatever the mission statement that's online versus whatever the actual working legal aspect of the day-to-day, then you can see, like, is it being what it says it is or not, which very of course people who work within the institution want to do the mission statement part, but many of these methodologies are inherited from a time that doesn't exist anymore. So the project that you're referencing was to try and figure out how to separate the private collector's name from a public collection. And those regulations were from like the 70s, but because it had never been updated, people today who might not agree with that working or display or whatever just have to deal with because it hasn't been updated. So in a sense, it's thinking about, like, okay, if the museum moves very slowly in the update of its working habits, then maybe these letters might prompt some slow motion into a direction where these, like I said, again, these objects might still reference this other past life. So even within with Jane's letter, there's some general proposals. It's not that it might work or might not work, but I think that one was to continue collecting whatever residue might fall off of those objects and like stick them out in the rain, or change the ownership of the objects to the rain, and then it's a permanent loan to the museum, or some other type of like legal loophole that might actually, not return, but like reunite the original intention. No?
Mm-hmm. So you, the last time I talked to you about this, you were still sort of hoping to have a dialogue about this catalog shift that you're proposing for the Peabody. that you've been delving into their online catalog and are actually hoping that they will change the official category of ownership.
Yeah, I mean, those are just suggestions, because I don't actually know how you would change, the actual steps to do that. But I think that there must be a way, if someone who knows, that works within the museum, figures out a way how to do it. No, and it doesn't have to be this way. It's just a beginning conversation, and that's why I think the letter with Jane. In my hope, it was this type of conversation between back and forth, until we might figure out a way in which everybody can, not everybody, but all of the entities who have stakes on that material might be satisfied.
Mm-hmm. I mean, one thing that Jane talked about in the introduction was basically that institutional practices have shifted quite dramatically over the course of the 20th and into the 21st century. And obviously, claims of ownership that are present claims are being questioned in many different contexts. And so obviously this, you thinking about not just sort of individual institutional ownerships or ownerships based on different countries' claims, but other historical claims, I think is very intriguing, provocative, but it's always interesting to think how that might relate to this much larger dialogue that's going on right now.
Yeah, and I think that when I was thinking about this regulation and policy of antiquities, I think at the same time I was reading your book about copyright and this current, contemporary art questions and how who might own what once it does, and there were so many parallel things, just in different timelines, no? And so I think that many of these questions just came up because I was actually anxious about how my own work might exist in the future. And so that's why I was reading your book, to be like, okay, how does the law actually, I don't know how to write a contract for my own work, so I need to figure out how to do that, like for 500 years from now, because look at these ancient works and how they work. And so many of the questions also come from this link of the law and conceptual art. No, I think that the regulations and the methods in which the material exists within an institution is also so parallel to the way that conceptual art is made, whereas like there are some rules about material and how it's supposed to exist, etc., whether it's antiquity or new or whatever, and then it just lives within that. No, but I think it's easier to work through like world material if you think about it as like functioning in a conceptual framework, because there's not as much I guess damage that can happen by switching out the regulation with an artwork when you're testing it out in the studio than if you just play around with regulation with historical stuff. No?
And obviously a certain amount of what you're doing is thinking about both ownership and status shifts. And so at what point does the actual status or purpose of something change? I mean, does it change because it's collected by an institution that's secular in nature? Is at that point, has the spiritual quality left the object, or does it somehow remain even though it's not functioning in that sense? And also who has the opportunity to actually, articulate its ongoing status?
Yeah, I mean, I think these are questions that are attached so much about material and its relationship to an audience in a specific site. Lately I've been thinking a lot about exhibition copies, and it's a similar thing where it's like there's a specific material that at some point it was in relationship to a specific human at some point, no? And so, and same with these objects, like there was somebody who threw it in the pit or whatever, no? And so to try and think about how it existing in a different context might change, or is the relationship with that person inherently attached to that specific material because it was that material that formed that idea in somebody's mind? Like, can it actually be replaced by a similar copy or something like that? But in a sense, I don't actually know the answers of that. Maybe it would be like finding a psychologist or a I don't know, material spiritual guru person or something. But I do, in a sense, think that that material, whether it retains or not the wishes or function they might have, it's still the historical interest for me is that at some point that piece of mud held somebody's belief, and the same as sculpture today, like every artwork is a similar pile of different type of materials that somebody believes or makes an idea from, etc.
And the other, another part of that is obviously that you are working collaboratively, including with some of the exhibition spaces. Now I'm getting a cue that we need to wrap up our discussion, and then there's going to be a sort of repeat of the slideshow so that people who came in a little later can see the installation. And then Meg will take over, the curator of the show will take over the question and answer. But one thing that I'm really hoping to hear in your dialogue when you talk with Meg is just some of the ways in which the exhibition space was involved in something that we're thinking of under your authorship.
Right. Yes, I have left a lot of the works as collaborations with either other humans or other entities or something. But I think that at least for that Copal and Rain reunion piece, and even the frame that holds the fabric, I think that it's important to also involve the institution in terms of deciding what that reunion with the water, the rain, and that material looks like, because they were so involved in the separation of those things to begin with. And so in a sense, it's kind of like thinking about if the rain has if the rain was the audience of these reunions, they would see many different type of reunions, no? And it's also because I don't necessarily know if it works or not. So then I'm thinking like, okay, if the work keeps getting shown, then there would be, you know, indefinite amounts of different types of water getting onto it. No?
Mhm. Okay, I think they definitely want to go to the back to the slideshow. So I'm going to
Okay.
sign off and let the slideshow and then the Q&A commence.
Hello, welcome everybody. I'm Meg Rotzel, curator of the exhibition, and thank you Martha and Jane and Gala. I'm excited to talk more with you. Thanks to everybody who've been submitting questions. We have a lot of questions, so I'm going to be kind of condensing them, and Gala and I will have a conversation based on those, and I really appreciate all of that. So Gala, I'm glad we get to talk a little bit more about this. I've been working on this exhibition with you for 18 months, if not more. And I've seen a lot of questions about how you place yourself in relationship to this work and to this research, and then how you're thinking about both the Maya people and the items in the collection and how you place your relationship with this. And I particularly think it would be interesting to talk about that with the Copal sculpture, because I feel like that sculpture actually sits in the middle of it because of the material and because of like the role that the institution, me standing in for the institution, and the act of watering that sculpture. So
Yes. Yeah, I think that maybe in the broad range of my works with specific objects from different cultures and collections, you know, I'm not a Mayan expert at all, but I know how those objects have been filtered through the methodology of the institution. And so and this is the reason why, you know, with these specific objects from the Peabody, it was important, you know, because people are like, oh, what might Maya people want? And then in a sense, it's like, how would you be able to find that out when it's an entire country? And this specific, the specific person who donated that to its religious, spiritual beliefs is not here anymore. And so in a sense, it was thinking about who the last owner of those objects were. When I think about those objects being in the cenote, I'm thinking like there was a person who intended that to be in the cenote itself, not in a museum, not anywhere else, but somewhere in relationship with the rain, you know, because I can't speak for other Maya objects that might exist in the collection, but these specific ones from the cenote were put in as offering to the rain. And so if I just follow that logic, then it belongs to the rain now. No?
Yeah.
And the rain is still around. And so in a sense, it's thinking about like, okay, what are the things that since it was last in the water, like that person intended to originally, what are the things that have come in between that relationship? No, and so it was, of course, the dredging and then the legal documents that moved it from one place to the other, and now it's how the museum stores it in its collection. And those things I can actually understand because they are like about the international law of objects all over the US, really from everywhere. They follow the same sort of logic. And then also conservation methodology, which is pretty standard across the border, which is the kind of the questions I'm trying to ask, where it's like, how can you apply these overall methods to keeping these objects that all of them have different original functions and meanings to ancient peoples all over the world, no?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that is the framework in which I'm coming from, is basically figuring out how objects that are supposed to be ritual still might be doing a function that I know or not know within the museum. And of course, there have been other institutions that have, of course, the Peabody included, involved people from specific communities in how to resolve those the specific care of those objects. Yeah. But the ones in the exhibition itself, our last owner was the rain. And so it's thinking like, okay, what, the rain is still here, no? And so in a sense, it's never an entity that left.
And this is what I'm so interested about, this idea of the rain. And this is something that we've talked about for a long time. And then not until I had to do the work of collecting the rain, which in the case of here in Cambridge was collecting the snow. And then having to have an actual physical interaction with material, that something that is a concept becomes a material, and not only a material in the sense of like, oh, we made a sculpture, but that sculpture, in fact, requires myself as a curator to be in relationship with a audience member who could be a conservator, or could be a student, or could be anyone really. And then we have to do this thing. And then it makes me think, oh, well, this ineffable like moment of like, I collected the rainwater. I actually have it here in my office. We'll invite people, and then we will do a thing that is a direction that we will follow, the way that you would follow a direction to conserve something, but this is a different kind of direction. And I started it like that process of doing on the part of the curator, but also the part of a regular person, is really like something that is new, I think, in your work, and is different than, say, the drawings. And I've had some questions about the drawings, and that you've drawn, just explain it again, you've drawn every item that you could find on the cataloging system, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. And that act of drawing for you, what is that?
I think it's mostly first to understand the material in the collection, and then to understand the scale of it, because so many of these things that we're talking about through mediation of institution also comes from the history of cataloging things, no? And so that definitely, when you look at the system of cataloging, it doesn't account for a spiritual function or a spiritual dimension or any other non-scientific looking cataloging ways, no? And so to me, it's a very filtered way of understanding something that was ritual to a person before, no? It's really just a picture of also the leveling, for me, it just feels like a very filtered version of something that has a lot of life, and now it's just very Excel looking.
Yeah, yeah, they're very flat, because each one, a lot of them have those little material, those scale, or I could tell what goes up and what goes down because of that. There's bags that you've drawn beautifully around them, that there is this flattening, but there's also, because they're drawings and because they're so large scale and so detailed, they also have the trace of the artist. So they may be really flat in Excel, but at the same time, they have a life to them that is like, it comes from your hand.
I mean, it's definitely another mediation of,
Yeah,
another separation of that material that is in the storage with how we can experience it. Because also, because I source them from images from the catalog, they're all photographed differently, and so they,
yeah,
somebody mentioned that, like, the floor is different in all of them, and so the way that the photographer also created that image is another level of separation as well. Yeah.
and another thing that folks may not know about fully is like the dust that's in the Copal sculpture. Like, that was another way we had to work with the museum, which was collecting that dust and kind of passing it around. So this specific dust is in how many sculptures now, and where are they? Where have they been? So to understand that this is actually a show that's distributed.
Yes. I mean, I think that it's irrelevant really to know if it's one or many of the separate versions, because it's like even one dust particle being touching the rain might be enough just as a gesture. It's not even a gesture, because it's actually literally the material touching the rainwater again, no?
Mm-hmm.
And so that question that you're asking is basically saying how much material is enough to make something, no? Whether it's one here or one here. I think it's just there's no minimum, or at least I don't know how to.
I think what more I was getting at is that this sculpture is like one of many, but it is a one thing. It's this idea that has been transmuted, and so we have one in New York, we have one in Cambridge.
Got it. Yeah. So what I was why there are so many spaces is because then it's involving many institutions to try and figure out a different way. So that's why that specific work comes with the directions that it's like, here's the material, here's a dust, and then you need to also be figuring out how to get rainwater onto it. And I'm not going to tell you how, because you have to also be involved in how this reunion might take place,
And we've gotten a number of questions about museum infrastructures and you've already addressed, like, there's these ways museums have worked. Some of the things that we're doing now are from the 70s. Some of them are we're really, the Peabody was talking about how they work with as many families and people of that origin as possible. And in your letter to the Peabody, to Jane Pickering, it says, well, here are these three different ideas that we can do. And part of my job is, now that the exhibition is installed, is to get groups of people together to be like, could we, would we, how would we? Because you as the artist, like, you've made this proposition, you've brought it forward in a very official way. And myself as the curator of a gallery that's in the institution is like, okay, how can we do that? And that there's openness, this kind of very logical, magical thinking that's happening here, which has made me certainly more like, oh, I can walk around with this sculpture outside in my hand and it will get rained on. And I didn't know that, and now I know that. And that is a kind of a remarkable thing. How do you think museums in the future, like, what do you see for a museum of the future? Like, we've got the 19th century, 18th, 19th century. Here we are in the 20th century. Can you see systems, or what would you see in a museum
I
What would
think
you
it's
agree on?
already somewhat happening to a certain degree. You know, I love to talk about this one sculpture that exists in the American Indian Museum that is a maize god that is supposed to be fed corn. And there's a curator job out there of a curator who actually literally has to stick corn with acid in the sculpture. And so it's going against the conservation methodology already just to do the function of that ongoing spiritual thing. And so in a sense, in the, you know, the idea that a museum might be able to change its function based on whatever the thing that it holds inside, temporarily or not temporarily, or together at the same time, is something that I'm really interested in. So for example, if a museum holds spiritual ritual objects within the collection, then by default that museum becomes a holy site for that specific reason. So somehow not to prioritize those objects becoming historical, but also the how those things within it change the building itself. No, there are other, you know, like institutions who might have like a day or a specific time in which the public can, of specific communities who have stakes in those objects, might be able to use those things how they were meant to be at the time. No, that's just basic. No, and so in a sense, it's just figuring out, okay, these objects that we have, who, let's just pretend like on hours they're historical, on the like special Friday of the day or whatever, you know, it's used however it might be for a specific not audience, but like really the culture it might belong to. No,
right. And this reminds me of, at different times, like you said today, is the museum just a dry cenote? And you've also said, is the museum a graveyard? And that it seems like what you're doing is actually transforming the museum from a dry, or giving proposals to the future of it not being a graveyard or a dried cenote. Because sometimes I've gone into museums and had this like sense of grief, and other times I've gone into museums and been like, oh, my people are here, or oh, that like I feel like it's like glowing from the inside. And I feel that you're working on that you're working on those edges.
Well, I think that in a sense, the museum has all along been that, you know, those multiple functions have been there since they accessioned whatever it is that changes the museum. So in a sense, it's just mostly thinking about updating the display, the way that those objects are talked about, because it's like, okay, these objects have changed the way that the box around it is, but now we only see the history part. No, so in a sense,
Right.
this is also why when you go into these places, you feel certain things that are like beyond museum feelings. No,
Yes.
because you know it's already something else. No, it's just more like updating curatorial method to be like, what about this other part that is there? No.
Yeah, and I think I told you about this last Friday when I had finished off the museum mount for Crippling, which is the same museum mount made whatever 40 years later for the textile that's on view. And I worked with T. Rose Holcraft, who is the conservator at the Peabody Museum, and she helped me make this like mount with no textile in it, everything but the textile. And then we were going over like, okay, what's the next direction? What's the next direction? Oh, it needs to get wet by rainwater. And I had just made this beautiful mount and I was like, oh no, this is gonna be a problem, because I just made this thing and I'm attached to this beautiful thing, and it's going to get photographed and I don't want to get scratched. Should I put it in the snowbank? And then I'm outside and it's all covered up because I have to carefully take it back to the gallery. And then I was like, I'm getting rained on.
You just unwrap
it. And I was like, this is the easiest thing. And so I had to share with you that like incredible moment. And it was letting go of this practice that I felt like I needed to follow these particular examples, but your work, I was like, wait a second, all I need to do is unwrap this. And that in itself is like a shift.
Yeah, because I think that you were just worried that it was art shape only.
Yes, it looked very much like an art shape only. And unfortunately, I'm at the last, and we have to do the last question. And many of these are kind of clustered together. So one question is there anything that when working at the Peabody that surprised you or delighted you when you are doing your research there?
I think what I really appreciated about working at the Peabody was the accessibility to the documents, because the staff who were working there, because half of it was done in person and then the other half was during COVID, so it was remote, and just the willingness to really engage with the questions that I was asking, and like really independent thinking to support the project. I was feeling like we were making the work together, you know? So, you know, when we were gathering the documents to make this room, interpretive room, then the people who we had been emailing for is like, maybe you'd be interested in this other thing. And so in a sense, just the availability and openness to accessing even shady past doings, you know, was like, oh, it's really transparent, you know, as transparent as it can be, you know.
Yeah. Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Gala.
Yeah.
Thank you, Meg and Gala, so much. I mean, it's just been a wonderful program, and thank you for your kind comments about our staff, Gala, but I know they've really enjoyed working with you, and it's been sort of inspirational to start thinking about all the things that you've raised with us. And I'm very much looking forward to seeing the exhibition. But I have a few things that I need to say about that. So thank you, Gala. And I do want to say that registration to visit her exhibit is now open. And so you can access that through the Radcliffe website, radcliffe.harvard.edu. And the exhibition it will be open from February 14th through July 2nd, 2022, Monday through Saturday, 12 to 5 p.m. And of course, you're also very welcome to visit the Peabody Museum in person. And I encourage you to access our website, peabody.harvard.edu, for further information on how to visit the Peabody as well. Since the health and safety of our visitors and staff are of primary concern, advanced registration is required before visiting the Peabody and the Radcliffe exhibition. Finally, I'd like to say that today's program has been recorded and will be posted on the Radcliffe website in about a week. And so you can check that out or make a suggestion to people who weren't able to make it this afternoon that they watch that. And for information about upcoming Radcliffe virtual programs and to see other videos of past events, please visit radcliffe.harvard.edu. Thank you again so much for joining us today, and please take care.